Thank you, and I would like to declare open this public hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Parliamentary Standards. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today and the respective lands from which you're all joining us from, and extend my respect to any First Nations peoples here today. My name is Sharon Clayton. I am the chair of this committee, and I'm joined today by the Deputy Chair, Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, as well as Senator Mehreen Faruqi and the Honourable Nola Marino, Ms Joanne Ryan, Mr David Smith, and I'm not sure, perhaps Miss Kylie Tink, or she might join us later on if she is back from her engagement. But this committee will be conducting today's hearings via video conference and in person. So I'm in Canberra along with Mr Smith, but the rest are joining us via video link. And these are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that giving evidence to the committee that you are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to this committee, and any such action may be treated by either House as a contempt, and it's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard on the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that an answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. Commonwealth officers appearing today are reminded that the Senate order specifically specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised, and a copy of that order is available from the Secretariat. The committee, just for your information, is due to report by the 1st of December, where a witness takes a question on notice at this hearing today. An answer should be provided to the Secretariat by the 11th of November, just to accommodate all these tight timeframes, sorry. And I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference and who are not speaking to just mute their microphones. And on that note, I really want to very warmly welcome Miss Alice Jury from the Human Rights Law Centre and Miss Shay Flanagan from Democracy in Colour. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witness has been given to you both. Is that correct? No? Ms Jury, you haven't? Okay, Secretariat's saying they've sent it to you. We will resend now.
Thank you.
So just bear with us for a few seconds while that arrives again. And for the Hansard record, I'm not sure if you have an order in which you might like to present evidence today. I'm just wondering, Ms Jury, if you're waiting for the information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses to arrive, you might want to wait to give evidence?
Forgive me, Chair. Actually, I misunderstood which additional information was coming through. That information I have received. I wasn't sure if there was another document that we were going to be speaking to today, but all good.
Oh, okay, terrific. Well, given that we have confirmation that you both have received that information, that's terrific. And for the Hansard record, I'll just ask you both to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today. I'll then invite you to make some short opening remarks, and we'll go to questions if the committee have questions to ask. And so that's just the order of procedure. But I'll hand across to you both now just to introduce yourselves, and then I'll invite you to make the opening statement. Who'd like to go first?
Thanks, Shay. My name's Alice Drury. I'm appearing as Acting Legal Director of the Human Rights Law Centre.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shay Flanagan. I'm appearing as digital lead at Democracy in Colour.
Thank you. So I now invite you both to make a short opening statement. You can do that collectively or together, one after the other, sorry. And at the conclusion of those remarks, I'll then call on committee members. So I will, just before I jump to that, sorry, I just want to confirm which committee members are on the telephone, because we unfortunately don't have a line of sight, and I'm being asked who's...
Nola Marino.
Nola Marino, thank you. Great. All right. Apologies for that interruption. Can I now perhaps ask you, Ms Flanagan, if you'd like to make some opening remarks?
Thank you. Thanks to the committee for hearing from us and the Human Rights Law Centre for letting us appear alongside them. I'm Shay Flanagan. I work at Democracy in Colour, which is an organisation by and for people of colour advocating for racial justice. We have thousands of members across the country from all walks of life who are focused on changing the institutions and systems that cause racial injustice.
We've just frozen on your video. Sorry, Miss Flanagan.
Sorry.
You just froze, so I'm not sure how much we might have lost of what you had to say. You were just describing the thousands of members that you had when we lost you.
Okay, so to reiterate, we've got thousands of members, thank you, across the country from all walks of life who are focused on changing the institutions and systems that cause racial injustice. We're led by lived experience of racism and racialisation, so I'm here today to speak to that. And our interests as advocates align with what this committee is trying to achieve. Our political institutions are key to limiting and enabling racial justice. And as Australia's population becomes more diverse, our representatives have a responsibility to ensure that racial justice is embedded in our governance. The Code of Conduct has enormous potential to lead the way and set the standard for racial justice as well as gender justice. We support the recommendations from the Discrimination Commission's report and the recommendations from the Human Rights Law Centre. And in order to enable deeper democracy and political participation in communities of colour, Democracy in Colour's top-line recommendation is that the Code of Conduct and connected policies and mechanisms carefully consider intersectionality and expanding the grounds of discrimination to include race, racism, racial harassment and other forms of harassment that have intersections with race. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms Jury, do you have an opening statement that you'd like to make?
I do, thank you, Chair. I'm going to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I acknowledge too the many generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists who are the first human rights activists and anti-discrimination activists on this continent. I acknowledge too that just days ago, the Noongar community in Perth lost a son in an act of violent racism. That act of violence is not removed or isolated from what happens in this place in Parliament. When politicians responded by acknowledging the alleged murder and allegations of racist motivations, they signalled to everyone in Australia that discrimination, which sits behind so much violence in this country, would no longer be glossed over or dismissed. By contrast, when people in powerful public positions are not held to account for racism, gender-based violence, ableism, transphobia, it implies that this behaviour is acceptable for everyone. It signals to the community that our government values some people's lives over others. It emboldens perpetrators and it discourages victim survivors from speaking up about their experiences. In short, discriminatory abuse in our Parliament makes the whole country less safe. I won't capture all of our recommendations made in the submission, but do just want to bring the committee's attention to a couple of them, one of which is that there should be a strong independent parliamentary standards commission to enforce a code of conduct. The commission should be made up of multiple people with a range of lived experience and expertise in best practice trauma-informed complaints handling. And in addition, that more detailed policies should sit under the codes of conduct and those codes should be informed by the people who will be impacted by them and by their respective trade unions. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and to the committee for all of its careful consideration of codes of conduct.
Thanks, Ms Jury. I will go to my Deputy Chair first up for questions and then go around the committee, and hopefully there's time and I might be able to ask some too, so we'll see how we go. Senator Payne, over to you first.
Thank you, Chair, and I won't start my video because it's interfering with the audio, I think. And can I thank both the witnesses for appearing today and participating in this process. In terms of some of the matters that have been drawn to our attention in the recent months that we've been undertaking these hearings, one in particular is that it is essential, and this was led in the first instance by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, that codes of the nature that we've been asked to bring together have clarity and consistency. We've been asked to look at 3 codes, as you know, one across the workplaces broadly for all those who are in those workplaces for whatever reason, one for parliamentarians and one for staff. And I wonder if you're in your experience, you have any observations to make in terms of that emphasis on clarity and consistency.
I think we're in firm agreement that clarity and consistency is an admirable goal insofar as it's achievable. I think it's possible that there are some standards to which sitting politicians may be held that could be higher in some instances. Nothing immediately comes to mind in terms of specific examples, but generally speaking, I think clarity and consistency are important goals to be led by this committee.
Ms Flanagan?
I am in agreement with Ms Drury. There are, I think, some instances in which members of Parliament be to a higher standard. So looking to the United Kingdom's Code of Conduct, they do specify that the integrity of the office is essential as well, which may or may not apply to staffers. But clarity and consistency across those, especially in terms of the forms of discrimination and acceptable behaviour, are essential.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Payne. I'm sure Senator Faruqi has questions. Do you have some questions?
I do, Chair. Thank you very much.
There you go.
And good afternoon, Ms. Drury and Ms. Flanagan, and thank you so much for coming to provide evidence to us. So I'll start with the Human Rights Law Commission's submission, in which you have said that gender is just one basis upon which people are discriminated against, and gender inequality is just one driver of harassment, bullying, and assault. And that submission also refers to the findings of the Jenkins report, that Parliament was considered by participants to be inherently unsafe for people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, people of colour, people with disability, and or LGBT plus people. And being one of those people who belongs to one of those groups, and having heard from many others who belong to those groups, what I have heard is that the visibility of naming this discrimination within the codes of behavior codes is really important, because they're often missed out. These are behaviors that people have experienced in workplaces, by parliamentarians and parliamentarians themselves and staff. So I guess I want to ask you, how important do you think it is to name these behaviors in the precinct behavior code as well as the parliamentarians and the staff code, and why?
Thank you so much for the question. I I think it is incredibly important that other forms of discrimination are listed explicitly alongside gender-based discrimination within the code itself. If I may share some of my own lived experience, I am a survivor of sexual assault and I have been sexually harassed in my workplace. I am also a brown-skinned woman and a migrant and a person with a disability, specifically a neurological disorder, and that all impacted on the way that I was able to I guess, advocate for myself within my workplace. And so those discriminations and the way that they intersect need to be pulled out and explicitly named.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Ms. Drury?
Thanks, Senator Faruqi. I would wholeheartedly agree with Shay, with Ms. Flanagan, and add we've really benefited from hearing the oral evidence of other witnesses, in particular Mr. Sitpomasan, and really hearing that, you know, by expressly including racism, ableism, etc. in the code, and the power of having that put on the walls of Parliament is incredibly important, and will actually have quite a culture shifting impact in Parliament itself. So on that basis, we support explicit inclusion of what we call some of the isms. We acknowledge that there's a difficulty in terms of there's an inherent value judgment in terms of what's included and what's not included. But I think starting from the basis of racism, ableism, transphobia and sexism, in light of a lot of what's been happening over the last few months in Parliament, we think is a very good place to start. And you know, the code can be updated as it goes, as other forms of discrimination come to the fore.
And some have also suggested that because, you know, we may not be able to include an exhaustive list, that you could actually say including those sorts of behaviors that have been widely experienced, or adding at the end and any other discriminatory behavior. Would you agree that that would cover it in general?
I believe that would be the right way to go. The UK code makes reference to respect as well, which kind of sits fundamentally at the heart of a lot of these issues. And I think all forms of discriminatory abuse is some of the language that we've used. Yeah, perhaps a slight preference for the language of respect as well as in the UK code.
We did question the UK commissioner, and I pointed out to them that they hadn't named these specific behaviors, and her response to me was that, yeah, we should name these behaviors. Just going over your submission, the Human Rights Law Commission submission again, I think you mentioned, Ms. Drury, in your opening statement as well, that the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission should be made up of people with range of lived experience, including lived experience of ableism, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and victim survivors of gendered violence and assault. Why is it so important that that commission have people with those lived experience? And also, do you think the Office of Parliamentary Staffing and Culture, which is another office which will be responsible of some of the changing of culture, should that be similarly made up of people of varied and diverse lived experience?
With respect to the second part of your question, yes, absolutely. I think insofar as possible, PWSS should be diverse as well. I think it's uncontroversial to say that someone who wants to make a complaint of racism, sexism, abuse, it makes a world of difference if you're talking to someone who knows where you're coming from, and they don't just have an academic experience of it, but they have a lived experience of it. And I think the safety in that is very, very powerful. And yeah, I'll leave it there. And
Ms. Flanagan, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I would. I think that lived experience in the implementation of this code is essential. I think we've heard, especially over the last few months, from victims, survivors of sexual assault and the re-traumatizing that happens through complaint processes, through police processes, and having something that ensures the safety of victims or people experiencing discrimination and abuse. That will go a long way to making sure that people are safe.
Just a question to you, Ms. Flanagan. Like I know that your organization, in partnership with HUE, conducts anti-racism training, alongside your other work. Just wondering, what kind of feedback do you get from participants and workplaces who have completed this training? And what benefits do they kind of provide if they provide feedback to you? What is it? Because we are talking about behavior codes, but also training that underpins prevention of unacceptable behavior. So I'm just wondering, what sort of feedback do you get on the training that you provide?
Thank you for the question. I think our feedback is often fairly varied, and it comes differently from people of color or people who have experienced unsafe workplaces or unsafe practices, and they tend to find it comforting and connecting and building a sense of community, whereas people who are maybe perpetuating some of these behaviors find it uncomfortable and sitting with that discomfort. But overall, the reactions are that being able to sit with that discomfort is an important part of cultural transformation and transition to give us safer workplaces, to make sure that people feel safe, people are able to participate.
Senator Faruqi, I've got a question from Ms. Ryan, so I might just try and get around to the others and we'll come back if there's time. Ms. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses appearing before us today. This is obviously an incredibly important conversation that we've now been engaging in for many years, but in this committee for a few months. But obviously where the work has been intensive. So every opportunity we get to hear from people outside of this process is important. So your contributions are very valued and thank you for them. We've been backwards and forwards across a few areas and around the notion of something being clear, concise, consistent, all of those things, but also around the notion that we already have laws in place that cover most of the practices here, that we are trying to create a culture where they don't exist anymore. And yet we know from the Jenkins review and the evidence that was given that those laws were being breached in our workplaces. So part of the remit here is actually about creating something that will support cultural change, if you like. We've had a lot of evidence around strengthening the language or not strengthening the language. So I wanted to get feedback on how legalistic you think language should be when we're creating a code of conduct. I wanted to get your thoughts too on, in terms of the inclusion of a list of discriminatory behaviours, whether there is any danger in creating a list that it could be perceived as being hierarchical in nature, where people might want something to be listed first rather than last, or whether you'd recommend to do that alphabetically, or if there's some rule of thumb that the Human Rights Commission uses in this space to avoid any debate around a hierarchy. Thanks.
I think to start with your last question, in terms of hierarchy, I think I mentioned before, of course, you can't, there'll be debate around what should be included and what shouldn't. I think starting with clear examples of what has been clearly demonstrated long-term and also quite recent issues lands us in the space of racism, ableism, transphobia and sexism. And that broadly crosses over with what Commissioner Jenkins recommended as well. So that's kind of where we're coming at this from. I think in terms of how things are listed, you can obviously say in no particular order, including racism, etc., in the code to avoid sort of any allegations that some things are being prioritised over others. I do acknowledge that providing a list of different isms is not an especially intersectional approach. And I think cannot emphasise enough that while there's power in naming those words in the code, it's incredibly important that the policies that sit under them are actually, properly deal with the idea of intersectionality. And in terms of how legalistic a code should be, I think it should not be legalistic at all insofar as it's avoidable. It should be able to be picked up by anyone and understood. At the end of the day, parliamentarians are answerable to voters, to the public, and the less that we can shroud all of this in kind of confusing legalistic process, the more accessible it'll be, the more effective it will be as a tool of public accountability.
Thank you.
If I'm able to just add to that as well, the idea of listing these things alphabetically is one that we have used at Democracy in Colour, and I find it quite effective. And I, as a reformed lawyer, I am a big advocate for plain language. And so I think the code itself being able to be easily understood by public, by staffers, by people who are not legally trained is essential to making it work.
Thank you. Did you have some other questions, Ms Ryan?
No, Chair, I'll leave it there. Thank you. And thanks for the responses.
Thank you. We've got a little bit of time. We've got about 15 minutes if I've got the clock correct. So I'll just ask a couple of questions and try and leave some time if Senator Faruqi is still looking for more questions. Yes? Okay, I will give my best shot. I wanted to ask, it's probably a question to you first, Ms Jury. Your submission talks about forms of discriminatory abuse, and I wondered whether or not how you might use that term, discriminatory abuse, and whether that is something you recommend as a tool of language for the codes of conduct. It seems to me that you've made some, both in your written submission and in your evidence this morning, some observations that code of conduct should be drafted in broadly to be as inclusive as possible, and that detail to be in those underlying policy documents. And I mean, that is, I think, quite consistent with the situation in UK and other jurisdictions, so that this is a bit more high level. And so I'm just sort of wondering, we've been toying around internally in the committee about how to recognise all of those behaviours that you would want to see prohibited or be, part of what makes a safe and respectful workplace. So would it be your view, if we can go on listing, and I can say to you that every time we have a witness, there are more items that people would like to have explicitly called out and named for all excellent reasons, but that list is getting longer each day. And so I wondered if you had advice about the use of the term discriminatory abuse, and whether or not in your human rights law framework, whether that was how you would use that, whether that was an applicable tool that might be a bit more all-encompassing with without having to offend anybody or any group for not having recognition. I don't explain to me what you mean by discriminatory abuse. That's probably the good starting point.
Yeah, certainly can. So the phrasing that we came up with in terms of discriminatory abuse, it's not a legal it's not a legal term. It's something that we decided to use so that we weren't constantly sort of listing various isms, but also bullying, assault, harassment. Also acknowledging that there's a huge amount of crossover between, for instance, what is harassment versus sexist harassment, etc. I think it's something, I didn't draft it with the idea that language would be picked up explicitly in the code. But now that I'm thinking about it, if that felt like, you would have to provide a definition, I think, of what it means, because it's not a sort of legal term. But for us, it was a useful catch-all to sort of, cover a wide range of behaviour.
Thank you. Is it a term that you would use, Ms. Flanagan? Or you're familiar with?
It's not a term I'm overly familiar with, and it also doesn't feel like an intuitive term. So I think while it is kind of broad and wide-ranging, I think the hunt for a term like that is probably a difficult one. So short answer, no.
Yep, that's fine. Thank you.
I'd also add that abuse generally, even if it's not especially discriminatory, should also be captured. So I think it is a.
Oh yes, I think.
Abuse.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. It was. It's really this struggle about, and goes to what Ms. Ryan was really getting at too, where to avoid any semblance of some sort of hierarchy of people's rights, or inadvertently leaving any the lived experience of any group kind of out there. And we've just, as the more we take evidence, the more apparent it is that there are many people's lived experiences who would like to see that reflected in codes. And you probably can do that more. Well, my question would be, is that given your advice to keep your code of conduct at a sort of broad level and then supply detail into the underlying documents, do you think that is an appropriate way to have some, to put all of those discriminatory practices as known, as recognised at law now, I guess? It's going to change over time, I suspect, but into that detailed document? Would that be, I'm interested in your advice in that regard. There's lots of gesturing and politeness. So I love it. Over to you, Ms. Jury.
I think I do think, and look, this is not a science so much as an art, but we, just to reiterate, we have been quite convinced by other witnesses that at least some of the sort of explicit forms of discrimination should be listed in the code, and I think that's just because they've reached such a threshold of harm in Parliament that they should be referenced. And I think, for instance, the reason for including racism can also be drawn to the fact that our country was founded on on genocide and systemic racism. We're talking about harm on such a level that I think it does justify explicitly naming it. And it's also, I think, worthwhile looking at the composition of Parliament. We only have one person in Parliament with a visible disability. We have very few people of colour in sitting in Parliament, and so I think by drawing on evidence like that, the committee could justify including some forms of discrimination over others.
Ms Flanagan.
It's a question I've grappled with a lot across a lot of different areas. And I am very much in agreement that there is a threshold of harm as well as public sentiment that probably justify things being included in terms of people's understanding of forms of discrimination and abuse, but also with the understanding that it's not exhaustive. And so the policies that sit under that can do some of that wide-ranging language that has room for everything.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll just keep consulting on that question, I suspect. So thank you very much for that contribution. And I'll go back to leave some time for Senator Faruqi.
Thank you very much. I think a couple of questions that I was going to ask and go a bit deeper into what we should name, but still be inclusive, you've answered, because I think one of the issues I've had, I mean, there is resistance in the committee for naming these things for the reasons you've heard, but we already named sexual harassment. We were talking about hierarchy earlier. We named sexual harassment and then no other sorts of discrimination or harassment. So in my mind, that's the hierarchy that's created, where that's unacceptable, but everything else is bunched into. So that's the problem I have. And I kind of really agree with your sentiment that those issues of racism and ableism and, have reached a threshold where they are causing massive harm. And, the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network submission talks about how impactful racist political speech is and how it can fuel hate and even violent ideological extremism. And for people who haven't had that experience, I think that's hard to grapple with. But I do have a particular question for Ms. Drury on another topic, which is about integrity. And your submission recommends that the code cover broader issues of integrity, but that's actually not within the remit of this committee, because we have been asked to develop codes to keep a workplace safe and respectful. So we've focused on the behavior code. But I guess, would you recommend that work to expand the code or to have a separate a code which deals with integrity issues in particular, that should be developed separately and that work should be done as soon as possible as well?
Yeah, our policy work on having a code of conduct really started from the space of integrity. It was before, Ms. Higgins' complaint and the allegations against Christian Porter, etc. So we thought it was important to include that in this conversation, not least because there are lots of issues that our Parliament has faced at the very least over the last decade that really should be caught by a code of conduct. Just to point out a couple of high-profile ones recently, the spread of disinformation that's absolutely undermining our democracy and undermining people's health in the case of anti-vax claims, pork barrelling, a prime minister appointing himself to multiple ministries. There are these sorts of things that are hard to necessarily codify and legislate for ahead of time, but everybody knows is wrong. And I think should reasonably be captured by a code of conduct, except that it's outside the terms of reference of this committee.
But do you recommend that be developed as a separately?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I think we've always considered a code of conduct, insofar as it applies to politicians, as being a holistic one, rather than separating out abusive behaviour from general integrity. But it's better that the two be developed than only one of them be developed and integrity be left off the list entirely.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And I just note the other bit of your submission on the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and that work is underway with, I think, PM&C are working in the Attorney General's Department to progress that recommendation 23. So again, outside the scope of this committee, but just to report to you that there is actually work underway on that front. And that brings us to a conclusion to today's Hearing, sorry. No, it doesn't. Yeah, no, that's fine. So thank you again on behalf of the committee for taking time out of your busy days and careers to share your experiences and expertise with our committee. We really appreciate it. Thanks very much to Ms. Jury and Ms. Flanagan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a bit of paper I was after. And I forgot to mention, I don't think you did take questions on notice, but if you did, we'd like that back to us by the 11th of November. Thank you. My apologies. I should have said that before. Thank you. And I'm just going to check if we have online. No, not yet. Okay, we might just adjourn for a couple of minutes while we're trying to connect with the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network. Thank you. Wanted to let Ms Markwell know, particular at this point, that we're just waiting for your colleague to be able to join us. He's getting some dial-in details and will be able to join us via teleconference, I understand. So what we will do is I will just start some of the more formal aspects of the proceedings, and then I'll be able to welcome Mr. Kerr when he joins us as well. So, but it is, yes, it is now 2:43. So I'd like to welcome Ms. Rita Jabri-Markwell, and shortly we'll be joined by Mr. Mustafa Kerr from the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network. And I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you. Is that the case? Excellent, thank you. And for the Hansard record, well, we might have to wait. Is Mr. Kerr close to joining us? Sorry. Otherwise, Ms. Markwell, are you happy to begin proceedings while we are joined by your colleague?
Yes, I'm sure that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I might get you, just for the Hansard record, to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today. We'll start with that.
Rita Jabri-Markwell. I state for the record, my name is Rita Jabri-Markwell and I'm an advisor to the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network.
Thank you. And I would like to invite you to make a short opening statement if you would like to. That may be the dial-in of Mr. Kerr. Is that Mr. Kerr online?
That's correct. I'm on the phone line now, and I'm
Excellent.
sorry the web connection wouldn't work for some reason.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining us. I was just saying, we're just welcoming you. I should ask you as well, if you, just to make sure that you did receive information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses.
I did, thank you.
Great, thank you. So perhaps for the Hansard record, if you could just state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today, and then I'll invite both yourself and Ms. Markwell to make any opening comments or statements that you may have.
Sure. My name is Mustafa Keir, and I appear as Director of the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network today.
Thank you. And I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of those remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions. So I'll hand across to you both.
Thank you. Is Ms. Markwell out online? Sorry, I just can't see her. Sorry, I can't tell if she can hear me.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Well, thank you for your invitation today. The Australian Muslim Advocacy Network brings specialist expertise in policy, research, media and law to secure the physical and psychological safety of Australian Muslims from racism and anti-Muslim hatred in the public sphere. And we wish to allow Australian Muslims to freely participate in public life without fear of harassment. Our vision is an Australia with a helpful and vibrant sense of nationhood, one that owns and celebrates the cosmopolitan nature. Our stories as Australians are now intrinsically woven together, and the strength of our liberal democracy is core in carrying out this vision. not only protecting the freedom of expression, encouraging quality debate, but also in upholding equality and respect amongst diverse peoples. The mainstreaming of prejudice, dehumanisation and Islamophobia, some of which we've seen in Parliament recently, has led to significant identity stress amongst youth in our community in particular, and those who are vulnerable. And frequently we receive messages that they feel they do not belong. And these kinds of narratives that demonise others are not welcome in our multicultural society. This prejudice erodes security and can lead to danger, especially for those who are vulnerable and our places of worship as well. We've had a recent experience in Queensland. We wish to make it clear through law, policy and education that inciting hatred and violence against people is not free speech. This Joint Select Committee on Parliamentary Standards, establish and develop a code of conduct in Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces, is a welcome step in that direction. I might pass over to Rita now.
Thank you. Ms. Markwell.
Thank you. If I may add, we are very appreciative of the work done by the Australian Human Rights Commission with their report Set the Standard, which acknowledged that a number of parliamentarians had shared their experiences of their officers receiving violent and threatening communications that were often both racist and sexist, emphasising the impact that this had on their health and safety. Evidently, in our written submissions, we have highlighted that this also has an impact on the public square in what we call shifting the Overton window, or shifting the window of what is acceptable public discourse, and if comments are being made which dehumanise groups based on protected attributes, that emboldens racist nationalist movements within Australia and leads directly to hate incidents and hate crime, which are largely unquantified in Australia. So we, in addition to our written submissions, we'd like to submit that we think that the code, any sort of code, should have clear standards and obligations and not only be based in principles. It should be clear enough to be enforceable and provide certainty about what behaviour crosses the line. We draw your attention to the Queensland Code of Ethical Conduct for Parliamentarians, which includes a provision about respect for persons, which I have provided some draft wording to the committee for your reference ahead of our appearance this afternoon, which is based largely on the wording in that Queensland code. However, it strengthens it slightly by making it clear that members should not use abusive, obscene or threatening language, either oral or written, or behaviour towards any officer, employee or member or members of the public, making it clear that sometimes such language is used towards groups, not only individuals, and that we also strongly encourage the committee to consider dehumanising discourse as a particular type of harmful speech, which may not be picked up by language, by standards that, you know, set the standard at violent or threatening or abusive or obscene even, because a lot of that type of speech is very endangering to groups in society. It has a direct correlation, which is established in research, with genocidal violence, and is and often done through portraying or through indirect language that portrays one of those things which I've put in that in that document which I've sent, and I don't know whether you want me to read it out for the record now.
I might just check. I mean, it was circulated quite late, so I'm not sure whether, I mean, members of this committee would have now received it in their emails, but we've had extremely short breaks, so I'm not sure whether people have had an opportunity to read that document or not. And we probably do need to, I wanted to seek your advice if you'd like this to be kind of tabled as part of your evidence.
Please.
Okay, so I might just get somebody to move that way, that it be tabled off the committee centre, Faruqi? Yep, thank you.
So moved, Chair.
Thank you. If you wish to read that out, I think that will be fine. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to, I want to use the exact wording which I sent to you. We have this definition which we've developed as part of our work in responding to online hatred to provide a guidance to the Australian government on how to disrupt dehumanisation online. But obviously political actors in their speech are extremely influential speakers. That's borne out in all the evidence on, historical genocides that any political actors are extremely influential in the speech they use. So it is really important to make sure that there is alignment in protecting the public sphere across, whether we're talking about the political sphere, or we're talking about the online sphere or the media sphere, that we sort of have that alignment where we are clearly putting a line in the sand about the dehumanisation of groups. And we've defined that as portraying a class of persons identified on the basis of a protected characteristic as polluting, despoiling or debilitating Australian society, having a diminished capacity for human warmth and feeling or independent thought, posing a powerful threat or menace to the Australian people, or being responsible for and deserving of collective punishment for the specific crimes or alleged crimes of some of their members. And as explained this in our email to you, this definition has been developed drawing from a study which we conducted on Twitter and Facebook last year, and also drawing from extant literature on genocide prevention. We think that it would be really prudent, given Australia's role in the Christchurch massacre, given our long, very sad history in relation to the historical massacres of First Nations peoples, and also the continuing problem of hate crimes that are largely unquantified in Australia, that Australia make a clear stand against speech which has been shown to lower people's moral barriers towards violence, towards a group, and the benefits would not only be to social cohesion in Australia, but also advancing Australia's position internationally, including its commitments under the Rome Statute to prevent genocide, which I think would be very warmly welcomed Australia and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Markwell. Can I just ask, this set of words that you've put under the subheading of respect for persons, did you see that as forming part of the code, or I'm just seeking your advice now?
Yes, so we think it's important. It does form part of the code. In terms of obligations, we think that with any code of practice that we've seen in Australia and overseas, that where it tends to be based in principles, sometimes it's hard to know what is the exact line that is crossed, and that it is important that it's drafted in a way where it is shown as a standard, and that it's clear enough. So we've suggested some wording there, which is drawn from the Queensland Code, which, as you see, deals with respect for persons more broadly, including staff, and then it deals with respect at the level of not using abusive, threatening or obscene language directed at a person. And then it also speaks to what we've added to that is to look specifically at speech which may not fall into those categories, but historically has been shown to be very, very harmful. And if I don't know whether this example is entirely appropriate because it was made inside Parliament, but for example, the former Senator Fraser Anning's speech where he referred to the final solution for Muslims, that's an example where it's questionable whether that would be regarded as abusive. It may be regarded as obscene, but in terms of, obscene usually refers to immoderate language in the courts. And then in terms of threatening, usually we're looking at for threats of violence. But one of the biggest threats that the community faces is political actors actually constructing certain communities as a threat. And that's not covered by, it's just not covered by where our parliaments have gone so far in recognising harmful speech. I think we need to just go that extra step to recognise something which does lead to violence and discrimination and, terrible harms, but is done in a more pernicious way.
Mm-hmm. So just before I hand across to the Deputy, I mean, would you see this as if there was a general principle of having, of valuing and having respect for everyone, for example, I mean, would you see this as part of the documentation that might help give guidance and definition to what respect meant in these contexts? Or do you see this in some other context? Sorry, I'm just trying to understand where you are envisaging these sets of words appearing in a code or in the accompanying documentation that gives guidance to a set of, values or principles.
In terms of providing guidance, it's always going to be the strongest if it's actually in the most visible place possible, as opposed to buried in documentation. We are wanting it to be really clear that Australia has no tolerance for any sort of speech that is going to lead to hate-fueled violence and I think that's a very, it will lift awareness dramatically about the impact in particular of dehumanisation as a harm, which, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Sorry, I will, I usually leave my questions to the end, but I just want to try and understand the framework. I'll go to the Deputy Chair, Maurice Payne, first.
Thank you, Chair, and can I thank the representatives of the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network for joining us today as witnesses to this hearing. And I apologise if I turn on my video, then we have a mess up on the audio, so it's easier just to keep to audio. And thank you for your material, which I haven't, as the Chair said, had time to go through in detail. Can I ask whether the network has provided advice on the development of codes of conduct similarly elsewhere around Australia and what that experience might have been?
No, we haven't, but we've had a look through, we've done a bit of a review to see, what exists in terms of good standards to draw upon, but it's not a complete review. But we could provide that on notice.
I understand. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Payne. Senator Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Ms. Markwell and Mr. Keir, and thank you so much for coming to provide evidence to us. Your submission talks about how impactful racist political speech is and how it can fuel hate crime and violent ideological extremism. And you have talked a little bit about it in the opening statement, but I'd like you to explain to the committee a bit more, which might not have the lived experience of these issues, how the Muslim community is harmed by the words that some politicians that you have mentioned in your submission, like Fraser Anning and Senator Pauline Hanson? What impact and harm does that cause in the community?
Yes, so it's a very real impact. When Fraser Anning made a video outside Holland Park Mosque in not the last federal election, but the federal election before, it was only a matter of months before we had St. Brenton Tarrant graffitied across the front of that mosque and a call to kill and expunge Muslims painted across the front of that. And of course, then that was treated by the police as property damage because we don't have proper hate crime laws here. So there are layers of trauma that are enlivened every time there is political speech. There is evidence internationally that political speech leads directly to escalation in hate crime. We've seen even just recently, it's completely anecdotal, but we do have concerns about some of the coverage related to the repatriation of the women from Syrian camps, that may have been connected, and we are to some of the recent hate crimes that we've experienced in Queensland. So a violent threat was left on a mosque here, saying he was going to kill all Muslims and their families and burn down their mosques. And we do tend to see that correlation with any sort of political speech where there is a suggestion that Muslims are a threat and pose some sort of demonic or subhuman threat to Australian society. And we unfortunately did see a number of Facebook posts from Pauline Hanson appealing to those sentiments. So it is a very, very live issue. And when it does happen, it immediately brings back the trauma of Christchurch. Immediately we are fearful for our husbands. We are fearful for our sisters who wear hijab. Immediately we are fearful about existing. Mm-hmm. And I that's just for ordinary people, but I can't imagine what it's like for a Muslim who's working in Parliament House to be working in a workplace where that sort of language can go past without any consequence.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry that I have to bring this up, and it does trigger trauma for us, but I guess what I'm trying to get embedded in these codes is that sort of behavior that causes this harm and trauma, and that it's unacceptable. So given that what you've said, the impact of these words is on the community that a parliamentarian can quite easily say, do you think it is important that these codes of behavior that we are developing, which some of which will be, put everywhere in parliamentary workplaces, that they specifically name and call out racism, for instance, as a behavior which is unacceptable, which will not be tolerated?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, why would we do it for sexism but not racism? I mean, especially in the wake of the Christchurch massacre, in the wake of it being a constant, source of pain in the Australian community. Even just with the recent, death of Cassius Turvey in Western Australia, there are so many points of pain in the Australian community when it comes to racism. I think it would just be even another layer of pain if racism was to be ignored.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to, I guess, we're developing these codes of behavior to make Parliament a safer and more respectful workplace, but obviously that will have flow-on effects for the community, hopefully, to be a more safer and respectful kind of area as well. And I guess, do you think also prohibiting behaviors like racism could assist in making maybe in some way a Parliament a more diverse place and then hence more representative of the community as well?
Yes. Not only for people who want to be involved in public life, run in politics, but even for people who want to work there as staff. I think it's it can be a very, very toxic environment based from what we observe from the outside. And that sort of constant violence that we see, even in speech, that's what we talk about, hate speech, as being a form of psychological violence, especially when it goes past without any sort of consequence. I'm sure you can speak from personal experience about this from recent times, but what happened to you was hurtful and harmful to many other people around Australia, because we empathise and we know that if we were there, that would probably happen to us, and the same consequence would be, you know, it has a very strong chilling effect on participation, political participation.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ms. Markwell. I heard from many of those people who were triggered and hurt and harmed by what happened in Parliament recently with this, with what Senator Hanson said. One more question, and then Chair, maybe back to you. Just one.
No, there are
question.
other people before me, so
Okay.
I'm just checking how much time I've got left. Okay, if you've got one more, go for it, Senator Faruqi. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask about training, because, of course, you know, we can develop the best behavior codes, but unless they work towards preventing these sorts of behaviors, then, you know, we haven't actually made that cultural change. So I'm just wondering if you had a view on what sorts of training should parliamentarians and staff go through. I mean, and I'm thinking particularly talking about racism, you know, anti-racism training, First Nations cultural awareness training. Should those sorts of training be kind of an ongoing in our workplace, and should they be mandatory?
Yes, they should be mandatory, absolutely, and it should be ongoing. But I would also add that a lot of cultural competency training, awareness training, is compromised by the fact that we don't have diversity in our in positions of power and decision making when it comes to this. So ultimately, until we get that diversity, I think a lot of people are going to continue feeling fearful and discouraged from reporting. But the training has to be really rich with context from the communities that are affected, so they can advise what it looks like and sounds like in their context and the impact.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. And sorry, the person that I thought had a question actually had to leave, so sorry for that interruption there. And I do want to just acknowledge at the outset for Ms Markle and yourself, Senator Faruqi, the pain and discomfort and indeed trauma that might arise from discussing these matters. I wanted to ask Ms Markle or indeed Mr Kerr, in your submission you also seek to have an inclusion of religious discrimination, and I am I guess I'm just wondering also in the emphasis you've provided for racism to be acknowledged, you, I presume, are also seeking to have religious discrimination acknowledged. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yep.
And we think that it should be also possible for complaints to be brought on intersectional grounds. So, for example, if it involves an element of racism, sexism, or racism and religious discrimination together. But yes, unfortunately, most racism laws, anti-racism laws in Australia don't seem to cover Muslims. So we are just very keen to make sure that whatever definition you use does cover the broadest range of protected attributes.
Okay, and we've also had asked for inclusion of sexual orientation, people's acknowledgement of transphobia, for example, to be called out and acknowledged. Gender identity, intersex status. Would you be agreeing with those as well?
That's sort of beyond the sphere of Aman, so I can't really comment on it. But from a human
issues.
From a human rights perspective.
Yep, sorry.
You're not, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Chair.
Oh, no. Sorry, I thought you didn't want to comment, which is where I was going to my next question. But if you want to comment, fine. Sorry.
I was just going to say that our definition for dehumanising discourse, sort of that sort of speech towards about a class of persons protected by, on the basis of a protected attribute, is again using that language of a protected attribute. So it's drawing on existing human rights law to fill in.
And I think that's probably why other people have also raised with us. It was just yesterday, the day before, people wanting to, a woman wanting to have her pregnancy status recognised as well. And there are, we've had, and we'll hear more from witnesses around sort of age and disability. I think there's sort of a range of human rights protected attributes that people are understandably wanting to see kind of within these codes, and these. And as law evolves, I think we see additional recognition, and we're certainly seeing that in some of the other jurisdictions now where protected attributes there are increasing numbers there. I'm just wondering, in terms of the safeguard, do you think, have you given much thought to the regime? It's not completely within the remit of this committee, other than we can make some recommendations around what sanctions and compliances sort of look like. And given, your lived experience, I'm interested to know what you would, there is a recommendation from the Jenkins report, for example, that there would be an independent Parliamentary Standards Commission that kind of looks at this, not parliamentarians themselves per se, but I'm just interested to know how, given the advice you've provided us about a definition of being a respectful person and what members should be, to prevent dehumanising discourse, what would be a sanction for a breach of that? Ideally, we're trying to prohibit the behaviour and prevent it, but in the course of it occurring, what do you think might be a sanction?
I would be open to different ideas on this, but I suspect something that is similar to any sort of sanction that is imposed for the use of threatening, abusive, or obscene language would be justified. We also support the idea of, a strong independent Parliamentary Standards Commission to be enforcing the Code of Conduct, and for that Parliamentary Standards Commission to consist of people with a range of lived experience. In terms of the specific sanctions, I think we'd... and Mustafa, did you want to add anything here? I don't have any specific recommendations, except that it should be proportionate and strong enough to send a message that it's unacceptable and that simply that the Parliament does not accept that.
And this may be unfair if you haven't read all of the Jenkins report, I'm not sure, but there is a page that does a fairly, there's a table and a page where Jenkins maps out a range of possible sanctions, and I think, it might be worth having a look if you haven't seen it to see whether that sort of is something that you would, recommend as a reasonable kind of starting point. I think there's, quite a list of possible sanctions to be used depending on the severity of a breach, and I'd just be interested in your opinions on that if possible, but take that on notice, that's fine. I'm not expecting everyone to have read every single page, but it is on page 244 if you'd like to have a look at it at some point. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I know you invited Mr. Cares to make a comment, so I didn't mean to cut him off.
I would just add that in my experience, especially when it comes to matters of racism or religious discrimination, I found that some level of education and awareness as a form of reprimand is highly effective, because usually that racism or religious discrimination comes from a lack of knowledge. So I just wanted to reiterate this concept of awareness and education when it came to considering forms of reprimand.
Yeah,
That's all.
You'll be very pleased to know it's the very first point that Jenkins goes to. So she says a requirement to attend training or to enter into a behaviour agreement. So thank you for that. I'm just checking in on my time here. Sorry, what have I got here? Okay, great. Are there any other questions that you wish to raise? Sorry, Senator Faruqi, just to check in. No? Okay, great. And well, I think on that note, I'd really like to thank you both for your evidence this afternoon, for the thoughtful submissions and contributions today in evidence, and to say that the committee very much appreciates that time, and we will now, where's my little sheet? Convene until when? Sorry. How about, thank you. So, all right. So again, formally, thank you very much. If you've been asked to take questions on notice, if you could provide any responses to the Secretariat by the 11th of November, that would be much appreciated. Thank you, and I do declare the public hearing is now adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.